Hey there, welcome back to Story Slices, where we slice through the best Reddit tales just for you. Let's dive right into the first story. The first one is the Tittle story, and it starts like this. It was a crisp autumn morning when I first noticed something amiss on my farm. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields as I sipped my coffee on the front porch. It was my daily ritual, a moment of peace before the day's work began. But today, something caught my eye that made me nearly spit out my drink. There, at the far end of my eastern field, was a structure that definitely hadn't been there the day before. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Nope, it was still there. A massive, gray building that stuck out like a sore thumb against the golden wheat. What in tarnation? I muttered to myself, setting down my mug and squinting to get a better look. It was too far away to make out details, but it was clear this wasn't some small shed or animal pen. This was a substantial building, and it was smack dab in the middle of my property. I've been farming this land for over 2 decades, inheriting it from my father who worked it before me. Every inch of these 200 acres is as familiar to me as the back of my hand. There was no way I had somehow missed the construction of an entire building. Something was very, very wrong. Abandoning my morning routine, I marched back into the house and grabbed my truck keys. As I climbed into my old Ford pickup, my mind was racing. Who could have built this? Why would they build on my land? And how on earth did they manage to do it overnight? The drive to the far end of my property took about 10 minutes, bouncing along the dirt roads that crisscrossed my fields. As I got closer, the structure came into clearer view, and my confusion turned to anger. This wasn't just some makeshift shelter or temporary storage unit. This was a full-blown garage, easily big enough to house several large vehicles. I pulled up next to the building, my tires kicking up dust as I braked hard. Jumping out of the truck, I circled the garage, my blood pressure rising with each step. The structure was about 40 feet wide and 60 feet long, with large roll-up doors on either end. The walls were corrugated metal, and the whole thing sat on a freshly poured concrete slab. "This is impossible," I said out loud, running my hand along the cool metal wall. "There's no way this entire building could have been constructed overnight. It would have taken days, if not weeks, to pour the foundation, erect the frame, and finish the walls and roof. How could I have missed this?" As I completed my circuit around the building, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There, on the far side of the garage, was a gravel driveway leading away from my property and towards my neighbor's land. Suddenly, things started to click into place. My neighbor, Tom Johnson, had moved in about a year ago. He was a city slicker who decided to get back to nature by buying the property adjacent to mine. From the start, he'd been nothing but trouble, letting his dogs run wild through my fields, hosting loud parties that scared my livestock, and generally showing zero respect for the realities of farm life. Now, it seemed, he'd taken his entitlement to a whole new level. Furious, I stormed back to my truck and peeled out, leaving a cloud of dust in my wake as I headed towards Tom's house. As I pulled up his driveway, I could see him lounging on his back deck, sipping what looked like a mimosa. The sight of him relaxing while I was dealing with this mess only fueled my anger. I slammed my truck door and marched up to his deck. "Tom," I shouted, not bothering with pleasantries. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Tom looked up, seemingly surprised by my presence. He set down his drink and stood up, that smug smile I'd come to hate spreading across his face. "Well, good morning to you too, neighbor. What seems to be the problem?" I could feel my face turning red. "Don't play dumb with me, Tom. That garage? The one you built on my property. Ring any bells?" Tom's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew wider. "Oh, that. Isn't it great? I've been needing a place to store my boats and ATVs. Now I won't have to drive all the way to the storage facility in town." I was dumbfounded. Was he seriously acting like this was no big deal? Like he hadn't just constructed an entire building on someone else's land without permission? "Tom," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "you can't just build on my property. That's illegal. You need to take it down. Now?" Tom waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, come on. It's not hurting anyone. That part of your field was just sitting there unused anyway. I'm putting it to good use." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Unused? It's my land. I rotate my crops, Tom. Just because it's fallow this season doesn't mean it's up for grabs." "Listen," Tom said, his tone turning condescending. "I did you a favor. That garage probably increased the value of your property. You should be thanking me." I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. Getting into a shouting match wasn't going to solve anything. "Tom, I don't know how to make this any clearer. That garage is on my property. You had no right to build it there. I'm asking you nicely to take it down and restore my land to its original condition." Tom's face hardened. "No can do, friend. I've invested a lot of money in that garage, and I'm not about to tear it down just because you're being petty. It's staying right where it is." I could feel my patience snapping. "This isn't a negotiation, Tom. That's my land. Remove the garage, or I'll be forced to take legal action." At the mention of legal action, Tom's smug demeanor faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered, puffing out his chest. "Go ahead and try. I've got friends in high places and lawyers on retainer. You really want to go down that road?" I stared at him for a long moment, realizing that reasoning with him was pointless. Without another word, I turned and walked back to my truck. As I climbed in, I heard Tom call out, "Think about it, neighbor. We could share the garage. I'll even let you store some of your rusty old farm equipment in there." I ignored him, starting up my truck and pulling away. My mind was already racing, trying to figure out my next steps. One thing was certain, this was far from over. As soon as I got back to my house, I called my friend Sarah, who happened to be a lawyer. I'd known her since high school, and while she specialized in corporate law, not property disputes, I figured she could at least point me in the right direction. "Sarah," I said as soon as she picked up, "I've got a situation here. My neighbor built a huge garage on my property without permission. What do I do?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "He did what now?" Sarah asked, disbelief evident in her voice. I explained the whole situation, waking up to find the garage, confronting Tom, his refusal to remove it. Sarah listened patiently, occasionally asking for clarification. "Wow," she said when I finished. That's pretty egregious. Your neighbor is way out of line here. So what can I do?" I asked, pacing back and forth in my kitchen. "Well, the good news is the law is definitely on your side," Sarah replied. "What he's done is a clear violation of property rights. The bad news is, given his attitude, this might not be a quick or easy process." She went on to explain my options. I could start by sending a formal cease and desist letter, demanding that Tom remove the structure. If he refused, which seemed likely, the next step would be filing a lawsuit for trespass and seeking an injunction to force him to remove the garage. "It might also be worth contacting your local zoning board," Sarah added. "I'd be surprised if he got the proper permits to build that garage, especially if it's on your land. They might be able to issue a stop work order or demand its removal." I thanked Sarah for her advice and hung up, feeling a mix of determination and exhaustion. This wasn't how I'd planned to spend my autumn, fighting a legal battle with my neighbor, but I knew I couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just about the garage, it was about protecting my property and my livelihood. Over the next few days, I followed Sarah's advice. I drafted a cease and desist letter with her help, formally demanding that Tom remove the garage within 30 days. I also reached out to the county zoning board, who confirmed my suspicions Tom hadn't filed for any building permits. The zoning board sent out an inspector, who verified that the garage was indeed on my property and issued a notice of violation to Tom. I thought this might be the end of it. Surely now that he was facing official consequences, he'd back down. But Tom, it seemed, was more stubborn than I'd given him credit for. He ignored my cease and desist letter completely. When the zoning board's notice arrived, he apparently tried to retroactively apply for permits, claiming it was all just a misunderstanding. It was clear that this wasn't going to be resolved easily. So, with a heavy heart and Sarah's guidance, I filed a lawsuit against Tom for trespass and sought an injunction to have the garage removed. The day I filed the lawsuit, I drove past the garage on my way into town. To my shock and anger, I saw Tom there, unloading a boat from a trailer and pushing it into the garage. He waved at me as I drove by, that infuriating smirk still on his face. That night, I could barely sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind racing with worries. What if the lawsuit didn't work? What if Tom found some loophole? What if this dragged on for years, leaving that eyesore on my property and preventing me from using my own land? But as I watched the sun rise over my fields the next morning, I steeled my resolve. This was my land, passed down through generations of my family. I wasn't about to let some entitled newcomer take it away from me. Whatever it took, I was going to see this through. The legal process, as Sarah had warned me, was slow and frustrating. Tom hired a high-priced lawyer from the city who threw every delay tactic in the book at us. They filed motion after motion, each one seemingly designed to drag out the process and drain my resources. But I wasn't alone in this fight. My story had started to spread around our small farming community, and I was surprised by the outpouring of support I received. Neighbors I barely knew stopped by to offer encouragement. Some even offered to contribute to my legal fund, though I politely declined. This was my battle to fight. As the weeks turned into months, the garage became a constant thorn in my side. Every time I drove past it, I felt my blood pressure rise. Tom, for his part, seemed to delight in antagonizing me. He was constantly coming and going, making a show of using the garage as much as possible. One particularly galling incident occurred about 2 months into the legal battle. I was out checking my fences when I heard the rumble of engines. I looked up to see Tom leading a procession of ATVs, at least half a dozen of them, right across my field towards the garage. I stormed over, my boots kicking up dust. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted as they pulled up. Tom, sitting atop a garish red ATV, just grinned. "Taking the boys out for a spin," he said, gesturing to his friends, all decked out in expensive-looking riding gear. "Thought we'd take the scenic route." "This isn't a road, Tom," I said through gritted teeth. "You're trespassing and damaging my crops." One of Tom's friends, a portly man with a thick beard, laughed. "Crops? Looks like dirt to me, old-timer." I had to clench my fists to keep from doing something I'd regret. "This field is resting this season," I explained, trying to keep my voice level. "It's part of crop rotation. Just because you don't see plants doesn't mean you can drive all over it." Tom revved his engine, drowning out my words. "Sorry, can't hear you over all this horsepower," he shouted, then peeled off towards the garage, his friends following close behind. I watched them go, shaking with anger. This wasn't just about the garage anymore. Tom's complete disregard for my property, my livelihood, and the basic principles of being a good neighbor was infuriating. I knew then that I couldn't back down, no matter how long this legal battle took. As the case slowly wound its way through the court system, life on the farm had to go on. I did my best to focus on my work, tending to my crops and livestock, but the stress of the lawsuit was always there, a constant weight on my shoulders. The financial strain was starting to take its toll too. Even with Sarah giving me a discounted rate, legal fees weren't cheap. I found myself pinching pennies, putting off needed repairs and upgrades to the farm to make sure I could keep fighting. But I wasn't about to give up. Every time I felt discouraged, I'd think about my father, and his father before him, working this land. I'd think about the generations of my family who had poured their sweat and tears into these fields. I couldn't let them down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we got our day in court. The trial was set for early spring, just as the first shoots of green were starting to appear in my fields. The night before the trial, I barely slept a wink. I went over my testimony again and again in my head, terrified I'd forget some crucial detail. When my alarm went off at dawn, I was already wide awake, my stomach churning with nerves. As I put on my best suit, the same one I'd worn to my father's funeral years ago, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I looked older, the stress of the past months etched into the lines on my face. But there was a determination in my eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. "You've got this, old man," I muttered to my reflection. "Time to take back what's yours." The drive to the courthouse felt surreal. As I passed by fields and farms I'd known all my life, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. For better or worse, this was the day that would decide the fate of my land. I met Sarah outside the courthouse. She looked confident in her sharp business suit, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. "Ready?" she asked as I approached. I took a deep breath and nodded. "As I'll ever be?" As we walked into the courthouse, I saw Tom and his lawyer already there. Tom was dressed in an expensive-looking suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. He caught my eye and smirked, giving me a little wave. I ignored him, focusing instead on keeping my breathing steady. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, nothing like the grand chambers you see on TV. The judge, an older woman with steel-gray hair and piercing eyes, called the court to order. And just like that, the trial began. Sarah presented our case first. She laid out the facts clearly and concisely. How Tom had built the garage on my property without permission. How he'd failed to obtain proper permits. How he'd ignored all attempts to resolve the situation amicably. She called me to the stand, and I testified about discovering the garage, my confrontation with Tom, and the impact this situation had had on my farm and my life. Tom's lawyer tried to trip me up during cross-examination, suggesting that I'd given Tom verbal permission to build the garage and then changed my mind. But I stood my ground, calmly refuting his claims and sticking to the truth. When it was the defense's turn, Tom's lawyer tried to paint his client as a misunderstood good neighbor who was just trying to improve the community. He argued that the garage was a benefit to the area, increasing property values and providing a service to local recreational vehicle owners. Tom took the stand, spinning a tale about how he'd misunderstood property lines and thought he was building on his own land. He claimed he'd invested his life savings in the garage, and that forcing him to tear it down would cause him undue hardship. I had to bite my tongue to keep from scoffing out loud. Tom's life savings was probably more than I'd earn in a decade, and he'd had no problem blowing it on boats and ATVs. The thought of him claiming hardship was almost laughable. As the trial went on, I found myself feeling more and more confident. The facts were on our side, and Sarah was doing an excellent job of presenting our case. Even the judge seemed skeptical of Tom's claims, often asking him pointed questions that he struggled to answer. Finally, after 2 grueling days of testimony and arguments, it was time for the judge to make her decision. As she began to speak, I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Having carefully considered all the evidence presented, the judge began, her voice stern, "I find in favor of the plaintiff." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Sarah squeezed my arm, a small smile on her face. But the judge wasn't finished. "Mr. Johnson," she continued, turning her gaze to Tom, "your actions in this matter have been reprehensible. You have shown a blatant disregard for your neighbor's property rights and for local zoning laws. The court orders you to remove the garage structure from the plaintiff's property within 30 days. You are also ordered to pay for any damages to the plaintiff's land caused by the construction and removal of the structure." I could hardly believe my ears. We'd won? Not only that, but the judge was holding Tom fully accountable for his actions. Furthermore, the judge added, her voice sharp, "You will pay all court costs and the plaintiff's legal fees. Let this serve as a reminder that property rights are not to be taken lightly, and that being a good neighbor involves more than just proximity." Tom's face had turned an interesting shade of purple. He leaned over to his lawyer, whispering furiously, but the lawyer just shook his head. There was nothing more to be done. The judge's decision was final. As we left the courthouse, I felt lighter than I had in months. Sarah was grinning from ear to ear. "We did it," she said, giving me a quick hug. "Congratulations, your land is yours again." I thanked her profusely, knowing that without her help, this outcome might have been very different. As we parted ways, I took a moment to stand on the courthouse steps, breathing in the spring air. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could see clearly into the future. A future where my farm was whole again, unburdened by Tom's garage and all it represented. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. True to the judge's order, a demolition crew showed up exactly 30 days after the trial. I stood at the edge of my property, watching with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief as they began to dismantle the garage. Tom was there too, watching from his side of the property line. He didn't say a word to me, but the look on his face was one of pure venom. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost? As the last wall of the garage came down, I walked over to where it had stood. The concrete slab was still there, but the demolition crew assured me they'd be breaking it up and removing it the next day. I crouched down, running my hand over the bare earth that had been hidden under the garage for so long. "Don't worry," I said softly, more to myself than anyone else. "You'll be growing crops again soon." In the days that followed, I worked tirelessly to restore the land. I tilled the soil, added fertilizer, and planted the first seeds of what I hoped would be a bountiful crop. As I worked, I could feel the eyes of my ancestors on me, approving of my efforts to heal the land they had loved so much. Tom, for his part, seemed to have finally gotten the message. He kept to himself, no longer hosting loud parties or letting his dogs run wild. The ATVs that had once torn across my fields were conspicuously absent. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was a quiet sort of peace that I could live with. As spring turned to summer, and the first green shoots began to appear in the once damaged field, I felt a sense of closure. The legal battle had been long and hard, but in the end, justice had prevailed. My land was whole again, and the future of my farm was secure. Standing in my fields, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Grateful for the law that had protected my rights, for friends like Sarah who had stood by me, and for the strength I'd found within myself to fight for what was right. As I turned to head back to the house, I paused for a moment, looking out over my land. The garage was gone, nothing more than a memory now. In its place, life was returning, green and vibrant. It was a powerful reminder that with perseverance and justice, even the deepest wounds can heal. I smiled to myself, feeling the rich earth beneath my boots. This land had been my family's legacy for generations, and thanks to my determination and the power of the law, it would remain so for generations to come. No neighbor, no matter how entitled or stubborn, could take that away. With a contented sigh, I headed back to my house, ready to rest and prepare for another day of tending to my farm. The battle was over, and my land, all of it, was mine again. And that, I realized, was worth every hardship I'd endured. The next one is an entitled people story. Many years ago I worked in aged care as a personal care assistant, the lowest rung of nursing staff, basically responsible for all the physical labor, such as showering residents, assisting them to go to the toilet, getting them in and out of bed, that sort of thing. I loved my job. I genuinely did, and for a while worked at an agency going from place to place before getting poached by a specific nursing home, which is where the malicious compliance takes place. I had been working there for about a month doing 4 days a week, all afternoons 3 to 10 p.m. and 2 of those afternoons were back-to-back Wednesday and Thursday, and this is where the other nurse comes into play. Every second Wednesday without fail, she would call in about 20 minutes before her shift. The 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. overnight shift was due to begin, leaving no time to get agency staff in to take over. Now I could wait until they arrived, but by the time they got there it would likely be after 12, and my trains home would not be running. So in the end I took on a double shift, 3 p.m. to 7 a.m., leaving me tired mentally and physically trying to get home on a packed morning rush hour train. So not much fun, but given the other option was to leave my residents without proper care, and that would never, ever happen. This meant that by the time I got home it was around 9:30 a.m. and couldn't get immediately to sleep due to needing to eat, shower and do the plethora of tasks needed to be done before going to bed for the day, meaning I wasn't able to get to sleep until around 12:30, and my train to work left at 1300 hours. This was obviously untenable, and after trying to do a double, followed by a regular shifts and sleep a few times, I realized I was becoming a danger to my residents, my fellow staff members and myself due to not being able to maintain concentration. In the end I told my RN that on the Thursdays after a 1-double I would not be able to do my shift for fear of someone getting hurt, which would open the nursing home, and myself to potential legal trouble, not to mention someone suffering because of my choices. So this had been happening for about 6 months now when I get called up to the office of the owner, who promptly sat me down and berated me for taking every second Thursday off and not being a team player. I what? Tried to explain why it was that I was taking those Thursdays off, but she would not listen, so in the end I walked out with a write-up and a threat of termination if this behavior continued. Fast forward to the next Wednesday when, as usual, the other nurse called in 20 minutes before shift start saying she couldn't make it, leaving us a nurse down for the night, so the only person on for that entire shift would be a registered nurse. And you can't lift or assist people with only one person without using a hoist, and even then you are meant to have 2 people for safety reasons. The nurse in charge of afternoons rolled her eyes after the call and said, "Looks like you are doing another double-bearded guy," to which I replied, "I can't, and since staying until agency staff get here is not an option since I wouldn't be able to get home, I suggest you call the owner and see what she recommends, and if she needs me to stay I will, but only if she gives me the direction herself and then confirms it with you." After 10 minutes the owner hadn't answered any attempts to call, and I said, "Sorry, I have to leave," and the RN for the night shift began to get angry, to which I responded, "I will get fired if I stay here and then need to take tomorrow off, or someone could get harmed if I stay and then work. Neither of these is a great outcome, so I have to go." Now I knew they were never going to be able to get agency staff with such short notice, and that even by the slimmest of chances they could find someone, it would be several hours between registering the request and someone showing up. So I walked out the door and hung around the corner for half an hour, knowing I would get a call sooner rather than later, and that I needed to be close by in order to get back and ensure my residents got the care they needed overnight, and had my idiot grin to wake up to in the morning, especially for the 3 people who loved early morning showers. The call came, I returned, and 2 nights later I got a call from the owner, who authorized me to work doubles as needed and take the next day off for safety reasons. As far as I know, the nurse who did the late call-ins was still working there when I left a year later. In the end, my residents got the care they deserved, and I got to get some sleep after working 15 hours straight. Are you hungry for more slices of stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to never miss out on any videos. See you tomorrow at Story Slices.